Hello, this is my second commentary on the conviction of Daniel Trumpet. My third will be released exclusively, well, not exactly exclusively, but I shan't be releasing it to the Tube Review. I shall be releasing it to the Shoot a Bit, which also allows me to speak more like a normal person. As you can tell, I modify my voice to some extent while giving these videos these days, and I get exaggerated anger. Because the Tube of You is monitoring certain issues, and that includes this one, but I shall nevertheless present my thoughts on the Tube of You. But this, as far as this series of videos go, shall be the final one presented for the Tube Review. It is not necessarily the last time I shall talk about Daniel Trumpet. It is not necessarily the last time I shall talk about the conviction of Daniel Trumpet. It is not necessarily the last time I shall make a video on the conviction of Daniel Trumpet as the main topic. But this is a continuation of my previous video, so it is not genuinely the same thing. Having said all that, I fear for the life of Daniel Trumpet, because for all the bluster of how people won't vote for a convicted felon, and for all the polling data, people seem to always make the same mistake Hollywood makes, and that is assuming that all that matters is a superficial fact, such as when Disney purchased Star Wars from George Lucas. They assumed simply putting the name Star Wars on a product would sell it, and it doesn't really matter the quality, and then they can use Star Wars as a vehicle for their own political and social agendas. They do the same with Star Trek, they do the same with Doctor Who, and several other brands. They actually assumed that people would simply continue to consume these things because they had the names on them, and because, using Star Wars as my continued example, they were assuming lightsabers, Jedi, look, they're in the robes, look, droids like R2 units and other things similar to that, and look, a thing that looks like C-3PO. Look, an Empire and Rebels fighting, it's Star Wars! And all they're really giving you is the things that look like things from Star Wars. They're not giving you good stories or good characters. In fact, quite often, even when they give you old characters, they don't understand them, and they don't understand concepts behind the Star Wars world. It makes it look like a counterfeit, because it may look like Star Wars, but it doesn't even feel like the world of Star Wars, such as the latest release, the Acolyte, which is changing the idea of the Force from George Lucas's idea that balance to the Force means all light and no dark, to balance is more like yin and yang, with equal parts dark and light, not understanding what these mean, not understanding spirituality and the philosophies that went into Star Wars, influenced by Eastern religions like Buddhism or the element of Christianity, because it was actually a fusion. The Christianity is downplayed by virtually everyone, but it is there. And not really understanding it, and simply giving you this superficial take that is then infused with their own ideologies. And even when they do understand it, they'll often scrap it because they don't like it, but a lot of it has to do with just ignorance. You see the same thing happening here. They thought that they could defeat Daniel Trumpet by simply getting him convicted, because there were polls that said that American voters would not be likely to vote for a convicted felon. And what we instead saw in real life was they got a conviction that they wanted. They were super happy about it. They held up signs calling Daniel Trumpet loser and all sorts of other things. They were partying, And of course the media, which is largely anti-Daniel Trumpet, kept saying convicted felon Daniel Trumpet, convicted felon Daniel Trumpet, convicted felon Daniel Trumpet. And they want that to basically be his name now. His name is convicted felon Daniel Trumpet. His name is not simply Daniel Trumpet. And they want you to know he is a convicted felon, because to their mind, you, the voters, took this poll. You yourself said you would not vote for a convicted felon. And they seem to have thought, when asking in the abstract if a voter would feel comfortable voting for a convicted felon, that it would have the same effect regardless of the situation. So their goal became simply to get a conviction so they could call him convicted felon Daniel Trumpet, believing that the only thing that mattered was that people would be less likely to vote for a convicted felon, or would even refuse to vote for a convicted felon, without realizing there's always more to it than that. That is the way it is in the real world. There's always more to what is actually being said or thought of or done than a superficiality. It's like the argument you hear from the sociopathic atheists who constantly attack Christianity, who would say nonsense like, if Christianity was true, we would expect Native Americans to be Christian and have the Bible before Europeans came, and now they're talking about Christian space aliens. What they don't seem to only understand is that a religion is not simply believing without evidence stories in a holy book, and there's more to Christianity than just believing in stories of the Bible and believing those stories are true. Rather, there's asking what you mean by what they're true and what the Bible teaches. And the Bible is ultimately not just a storybook. Large sections of the Bible have no narrative in them at all. If you read the book of Proverbs, for example, you are not going to read stories in the book of Proverbs, because there are very few, and the ones that are there are just analogies. They're not proper stories with laid out plot lines. And most of the books of the prophets, while certain events are being discussed more like a news broadcast would. They're telling you what is happening or what will happen in the future, but they are talking about something they're seeing right in front of them most of the time. Most of the books of the prophets are not actually recording only future events, but also discussing current events. But they're not doing so as, here's the story of what happened. They are simply discussing them and the implications of them. And they read far more like commentary on the news than they do like a story, even a historical account, because they're responding to the situation that they see. And really, the concept of religion that our culture takes for granted is a purely Western European, purely modern creation that did not really exist prior to the Protestant Reformation. Whenever I say this, I'm always ridiculed because, oh, you're saying they didn't have religion in the ancient world, but they had temples and worshipped gods! Because we've fallen into this weird habit of thinking of atheism as the opposite of religion. So if I'm saying that people did not have a concept of religion in the ancient world, it must mean I'm saying they were atheists and they didn't worship gods, and that's not what I'm saying. I know there were temples and they worshipped gods, but they did not have this idea that the belief in and worship of gods and supernatural powers is this thing called religion that has distinct properties and characteristics and is a different form of thought than anything else in humanity. It's distinct from philosophy, it's distinct from science, it's distinct from politics. They had no concept of that. And it's not just because they were admixing religion with these things where it doesn't belong, it was because they had no concept of it being religion. This idea that there's this special thing that humans engage in called religion did not exist. And again, it's not just they had religion, they just didn't have the word for it. They didn't have the concept of it. To them, their worship of gods was natural and was no different than politics or philosophy or anything else they were dealing with. The idea that religion is a special, distinct category of human thought did not exist until the 1500s. And it largely began to exist at the same time as something else we take for granted in our modern world did, the creation of the nation state, We now are so used to the ubiquity of nation states that we assume the ancient world worked the same way as ours did with nation states. And it didn't. There was no such thing as a nation state prior to the 1500s, and only Europe had nation states during the 15 and 1600s. The nation state is not the same thing as just a country. It's an understanding of what a nation state is that makes it distinct. And while I will do another video on it, because this one is actually about something else, to be a bit oversimplistic myself simply because it is not the topic, not to be a hypocrite, it's just I don't have time to be elaborate. A nation state is a concept of a centralized corporate entity that is largely defined by its geographical borders, although there are some rare exceptions to that, and in which one draws one's identity from based on a shared governmental system and authority, which also defines the culture for you. A nation state is not simply a country or a culture, it is the centralization of power within a society at a central government level that then imposes a form of cultural and ideological uniformity. The concept of a nation state didn't really exist in the Middle Ages, for example, where they had the feudal system, which operated very differently than the modern nation state did. In fact, most historians would tell you that there was no such thing as a feudal system. It was more like a collection of generally related, somewhat similar systems that we call feudal, but that weren't all uniform in their own right. But, for the sake of simplicity, the feudal system operated on concepts of personal fealty, land ownership, and certain other rights within a stratification of society, but the difference is there was no concept of a centralized corporate state which you would owe allegiance to. A state which is largely independent of the personalities involved. We owe our allegiance first to our nation would not make sense to them. The word nation back then meant people, and it didn't mean the same thing that we do. But we're so used to thinking in the context of a nation state, we assumed the Roman Empire was a nation state, and things like the Kingdom of France in the Middle Ages is a nation state, and they simply weren't. They didn't operate the same way. That's also what makes the Crusades hard to understand, because the justification for the Crusades was largely based on an understanding of the feudal system, which was basically in operation both in Arabia and in Europe at the time. It was something everyone at the time would have understood, but people today don't. And that's sort of the issue that you have with these polls, and it's the same one Disney has with Star Wars, or Paramount has with Star Trek. If you just ask someone before the conviction of Daniel Trumpet, would you vote for a convicted felon? It might very well be that the majority of people would say, no, I would not vote for a convicted felon. But that's because they're not really thinking of multiple possible cases. What they're thinking of is someone who actually committed a crime that they are simply guilty of, with no circumstances beyond that being considered. They simply committed the crime. With Daniel Trumpet, on the other hand, the perception is very different. He isn't just some guy who committed a crime for personal profit or for egotism or for vanity. Of course, people who are critical of him would say he is, but the way it is perceived by those who are supporting him is that it's a political maneuver to eliminate him as a political candidate and rival to John Gill, our current president as of 2024 in the United States of America. Euphemism, euphemism, euphemism. Instead of saying, oh, Donald Trump's a criminal, he broke the law, he's a felon, I can't vote for him now. What they say is, the trial was unjust, the charges were bogus, it's obviously trumped up charges, it's obvious that pun was not intended but can be taken as such, it's obvious that these people holding him accountable are only doing so because it's an election year and they want rid of him. And to be fair, they have a perfectly valid point to saying that because the trial was highly irregular. Daniel Trumpet was tried on very obscure charges. The crimes he was alleged to have committed were done well past the statute of limitations. There was a 2-year statute of limitations for filing false business reports in the state of New York, and it has been 7 years, so he should not have been tried. And in addition, the crime is a misdemeanor, not a felony, and can only be elevated to being a felony under certain conditions, such as if they were committed in order to conceal another crime, or if they were perpetuated in the commission of a crime. And the jury instructions given by the judge to the jury was, here are 3 hypothetical crimes that Donald Trump might be guilty of. If you think he did any one of these, then you can find him guilty of a felony count based upon the charges that were laid out, which is not how the law is supposed to work. He must first be convicted, or at the very least, he must first be charged with committing a crime before you can elevate the misdemeanor to a felony. The fact that all they tried him on was fraudulent business reports that should be a misdemeanor based upon a hypothetical chance that he committed some other crime is going to change the entire perception. Instead of it just being someone who committed a crime because they are greedy and foolish or arrogant and just wanted to enrich himself, it really looks like they started with the premise that Daniel Trumpet must be understood as a convicted felon, and then looked for a crime that they can charge him with and convict him of so that they can give him the name. And that is exactly what we're seeing. I don't really think the polls were wrong. I honestly do think that if someone were a convicted felon, it would make it much more difficult to get elected, and that many people would not vote for someone who was a convicted felon. But, as with everything else in life, context is king, and in the context of the modern political landscape, it looks like Daniel Trumpet was being railroaded. It looked like it was political persecution. It looked like Daniel Trumpet was being targeted by the justice system, which had been weaponized against him solely to eliminate him as a rival candidate. It did not look to the people who are supporting him like a fair trial. So, rather than being an abstract question about a generic man who ultimately doesn't have an identity, no name, no face, he's just a guy who committed a felony running for office and whether you would vote for him, we have a specific case with specific facts involved, and those facts mitigate against their concerns for electing a convicted felon. And of course, those who opposed Daniel Trumpet, those on the port side, they were celebrating and loved saying convicted felon Daniel Trumpet. They've been wanting to do that for years, and now they finally get to. They can say, convicted felon Daniel Trumpet, convicted felon Daniel Trumpet, convicted felon Daniel Trumpet. And it's not working like they thought it would. In fact, Daniel Trumpet received more donations after his conviction and more support, and more people flipped on him, which has caused a lot of concern. Which is exactly why I don't think that Daniel Trumpet is in a particularly good place right now. Because if he wins the election, they can attempt to remove him via with apologies. Like I said, I'm making this for the tube of you, and Al Gore does not like his rhythm disrupted, so they can simply get rid of Daniel Trumpet. For that matter, they could move to eliminate him even before the election. though I don't think that will occur, it could. And more than likely, we will see an attempt made to send Daniel Trumpet to either heaven or hell. And in this case, while I am not denying theological beliefs, I am using that to make a broader point about something else. And I'm really worried about this, because in addition to Daniel Trumpet being convicted, his former advisor, whose name is still in flux in my head for these videos, but whom I shall now call Stan Banner. It's a name similar to his real one, so I'm hoping that you can know who it is I'm speaking of. But Stan Banner is also now going to serve 4 months in prison, and will now have the label Convicted Felon Stan Banner. All while the media is making fun of him wearing 2 button-up shirts, which has absolutely nothing to do with anything legally, but they enjoy making him a clown. And it doesn't help that Airbag Honas, another name I shall likely modify over time. I'm much more likely to do that than I am with Stan Banner. But he ran wars of information that is now having to be sold and liquidated to pay off his bankruptcy. Happens to have been also convicted, albeit not of a felony charge, and is now going to lose the thing he is most famous for, his war on information, his free talking information systems. And while I'm not really convinced that that has anything to do with any conspiracy by political forces, after all, he has been well known to being caustic, and the families of that place, whom he accused of being crises thespians, who, after they had lost their children, he accused of being fraudulent. With him, it may very well be simply a legitimate case, but at the same time, we have a man who worked for the Central Agency for Intelligence on camera admitting that they were targeting him and manipulating people into getting rid of him and taking his money away. And the timing of the settlement, whilst they were still going after Daniel Trumpet and whilst they were still going after Stan Banner, and finally the liquidation being announced at about the same time that Stan Banner will be going to prison, being forced to surrender himself, and at the same time that Daniel Trumpet has been convicted and awaiting sentencing. The timing is not good, and it only lionizes the support for those who feel that those on the port side are attacking those on the starboard side. Indeed, many starboard side people who listen to these people, including Airbag Johannes, they simply view it all as a large-scale system attacking them, right or wrong. And I think it's actually a mix of both. I actually do think there are political machinations against Daniel Trumpet and perhaps even Stan Banner. But I don't see the same with Airbag Johannes. But the question isn't what I believe. Most people are either going to be on the port side or the starboard side, and the port side says they're all guilty, and the starboard side says they're all innocent, or at least some do. But I think a more nuanced approach would be better taken, and I do think that Airbag Jonas caused his own misery. But we're not talking about my opinion, we're talking about public perception. And with all of these, for want of a better term, conservative voices, and they're not all conservative, but we have a very crude way of understanding things today, but with all these conservative voices, as we call them, being silenced by the law, and when there's obvious political bias in the media reporting, as well as in the court system, and when we have an openly admitted Central Agency of Intelligence League, the timing of Airbag Jonas having to liquidate War of Information and Free Talk Limited, both of which are euphemism. The timing was terrible, and it's only adding to the fury that we see, a swirl of distrust, which I think is largely based on real concerns and largely predicated on real injustices being conducted by the modern State Department. That doesn't mean every case is legitimate, and it doesn't mean every concern is legitimate, even if the overall case is. But it may well be that the United States of Avalonia are going to see more protests and riots as we saw in the 1960s and the 20th century, or the 1970s, like the Vietnam protests, only with both sides at each other's throats. The left tends to be more violent and more prone to protesting than the right, although the media today tends to depict the right as more violent. It typically isn't. But at this point, people are getting pretty fed up, and I can see confrontations. And you have to remember, people are getting fed up with what we saw in the earlier media broadcasts, where people aren't making new shows, they're mining old ones and then simply destroying them with modern woke ideology, as it is called. So we have a culture that is vandalizing the past, not building anything new, and that is angering and polarizing and dividing society into camps and factions based on identity, and in which conservatives and people of traditional beliefs and Christians are being marginalized in favor of being swept away for a new ideology, whilst the people in the new ideology are largely driving it based on emotions and platitudes and not really having a cohesive way of centering their beliefs or negotiating and causing friction, as we saw with two parades, one for the seventh deadly sin and one for the ancient Palestinians. So it's not going to get better anytime soon. And no matter who wins the office of the presidency in November, I fear they will have no legitimacy with half the country, and there will be protests and efforts, and there may even be attempts on Daniel Trumpet's life. And I'm afraid that the U.S. economy will suffer. If Daniel Trumpet becomes president, of course, he'll open the oil pipeline, and that will reduce prices at the store. But a lot of people who are wealthy don't like him, and they happen to be the people who are the powers behind the throne, as you were. And they can easily deflate other aspects of the economy simply as a means of political control. And we've seen things like that before. Conversely, should John Gill win a second term, we will likely see the people viewing it as an illegitimate election, and half the country divided and hating him, and the prices will continue to skyrocket due to inflation. And this will cause major protests as well. So I'm not really sure there's a clear way out of this. But I am certain of this one thing. It was a mistake to be so petty and to convict Daniel Trumpet for fraudulent business records as a convicted felon. And that the American system of justice has been harmed, and that people don't trust it now. And the election process isn't trusted. And all I can see coming of this is greater division and disillusionment. And perhaps dissolution of the United Avalonian States. Though I don't think I'll go to that extreme just yet. More than likely it will be an attempt at eliminating Daniel Trumpet from the land of the living, and a choice between which person becomes elected and who is going to protest afterward, with the protests being largely defined based upon these narratives, and endlessly going to cause disruption as one part of society no longer works with other parts. I do think if Daniel Trumpet is elected, things will be better in terms of economy, because he will get the oil pipeline back up. He will, therefore, reduce the prices of things in stores. And that will placate even some people who don't like him, even if they don't admit to being placated. I do think that peace talks, which he was actually good at in his first term, would be held, and I do believe that we will have less warfare. But I believe that the strife within the domestic borders of Avalonia will be a problem. Whilst if John Gill remains president of Avalonia, we will see increased numbers of illegal immigrants. We will see a continued inflationary process, a continued devaluation of the currency, and protests over a loss of quality of life and distrust of the government, and fear of losing the country. So it was not a particularly bright idea to convict Daniel Trumpet. I'm going to give my thoughts in a more clear voice and without euphemisms and without leaving parts out that make it sound more repetitious than it needs to. I really did that so people could understand what I'm saying, hopefully. But here on the tube of you see through a glass darkly, and hopefully you will see more clearly on the shoot a bit. But I will release a third video announcement here. But for now, dear gentle listener, for now, I shall take my leave of you. Thank you. God bless. And goodbye. Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and because the previous video was 43 minutes, I want to have some sense of balance, and while it doesn't have to be exact, I don't like ending the video 10 minutes early. So I'll add a few extra thoughts. Related to, adjacent to, connected to Daniel Trumpet, and the conviction of Daniel Trumpet, as well as his allies, Stan Banner and Airbag Jonas. But not so specific to them. I believe that society shall, for want of a better term, see a shift starboard, because it really does seem that the port side really pushed too hard, too fast its agenda, and rather than accruing more people following them through a gradual introduction of these thoughts and subversion and replacement of an old one, they tried to be too in your face, and when they got pushback, doubled and even tripled down on their desires to have their port side views to spread. And this is causing a backlash on the starboard side, and more people are going starboard. But I don't think that we're going to return to that 1950s ideal that the people on the starboard side want, because the people on the starboard side don't actually want to go back to the 1950s. That's an ideal of them that was a caricature created by the port side. It's not true that people on the starboard side are racialist either, or at least by and large, or that they want an all white, all Christian America. That's not really what they want either. And it wouldn't really matter, because the way things are interpreted differ over time. So even if people on the starboard side did want to go back to a Leave It to Beaver idealized 1950s, it would still be a 1950s as they understand it today, not as it really was. Of course, it couldn't be perfectly implemented even on that scale. But the people on the port side don't really seem to understand people on the starboard side. They really don't put the effort into understanding them. And it's not an equal balance where neither side understands each other. It really does seem more people on the starboard side understand people on the port side than people on the port side understand people on the starboard side. People on the port side have simply stopped listening. And that's one reason the sociopathic atheist community comes up so often, because they are largely a port side movement. They are not people who merely lack belief in a God due to no evidence. They're pushing secular humanism. Even the ones that say they're not humanists because they value animal life to be equal, like Alex T. Smart, Cambridge, O'Connor, or the genetically modified skeptic Drew McCoy. In reality, they're just secular humanists who also stand for animal rights, but they have all the same beliefs that a humanist would, and humanism is deeply connected to progressive politics and socialism and being firmly on the port side. Regardless of what the I merely lack belief nonsense they like to spew is, it's very obvious that they are part of that overall movement. And I can guarantee you they neither understand conservatives nor do they understand Christians. And yes, I know most of them used to be Christian and they were devout, and the devout are the ones that leave, and it was reading the Bible that made them atheists. None of that's true. But they are a good exemplar of the port side, because whilst not everyone on the port side is necessarily an atheist, and not all atheists on the port side are necessarily militant atheists, the simple reality is they all use the same tactics and all have the same general approach of believing what other port-siders say about the starboard side than actually trying to understand the perspective on their own. Which is why you keep hearing about how on the abortion issue, how people who are pro not killing the innocent child don't really care about the child. They only care before they're born, not after. Proving it's not about life they care, it's only about controlling women and controlling their bodies. Because if they cared about the baby, they care after they're born and not before. It's just a given fact that people who are pro-life only care about the baby before they're born and not after, even though no one shows evidence for this, and there's plenty of evidence against it, by way of women's centres and church-run charities and the like that actually help single parents in such situations. We're constantly told those don't exist, and they only care before the baby's born, not after, and it's all because it's only about controlling women, not the baby. They are not trying to genuinely understand the topic or address it. the same thing with any other issue, and I can guarantee you, in my spokes with militant atheists, I have quite often run into them making various assumptions about me that have no basis in reality. And I have seen the same thing from port-siders, and they often have the same assumptions, because people in the atheist movement, like I said, are port-siders, and they will naturally assume that because I am Christian, I am conservative, and that means that I'm a white Christian nationalist who wants America to be all white and all Christian, which is absurd, if you know me. They also think I view myself as a patriot who, even though I hate the Constitution as it really is and want to throw it away, pretend I stand on the Constitution and the Founding Fathers and have this fantasy about it. And honestly, they're only right about not killing off the Constitution. I'm actually a monarchist, and I don't care for America's founders at all. God save the king, by the way. But they seem to think me as someone who loves pretending to love America, pretending to love the Constitution, pretending to love the founders, while really having a fantasy version of them as devout evangelical Christians, just like me. And they always assume evangelical. Like when Butker made his speech, some people gave a comment on this television show saying how awful it was because he was a racist and a sexist, and of course he was a white supremacist. Except the speech didn't mention race at all. He was a white supremacist. But he never actually indicated that in his speech, even though they know he did. But one of the most interesting points is they were not only nodding about how evil he was for thinking women are inferior and mere property and all that, and how he was a white supremacist and misogynist. One of them said, "That's evangelical Christianity for you." But it's not an evangelical Christian, he is a Catholic. And he was speaking at a Catholic university. You see things like this all the time, though. People have absolutely no idea what actual conservatives in America believe if they're on the port side, if they're the liberal side. They don't care to listen to the starboard side. They just assume things about them, which is one of the main issues you keep seeing. They make all these caricatures and they create this mythology that's quite elaborate, an elaborate mythology, and they refuse to consider that it might be wrong. And that's going to be one of the issues you keep seeing within the discussions of politics, as it were. Well, having not much else to say on the topic, and having just about expired the amount of time allotted, I shall ask you to view my more normal-sounding videos when I have uploaded them on the Shoot a Bit rather than on the Tube of You, and I endeavour to do so, health permitting, next week. But until then, I shall take my leave of you. Thank you. God bless, and goodbye.